The Mellotron gave the Beatles the opening of Strawberry Fields Forever, gave King Crimson the sound of the apocalypse, and gave Genesis chords that only worked because the instrument couldn't stay in tune. Every one of the approximately 2,500 ever built was assembled by hand in a single Birmingham factory, each containing 35 strips of magnetic tape that played recordings of real musicians back, 8 seconds at a time. Then the name was taken from them. A collapsed American distributor owing £80,000, a liquidator who sold the trademark to a company that had never manufactured a single instrument, a family of Birmingham engineers, financially sound, who could no longer call their own creation by its name. Today, the factory on Aldridge Road is a fishing tackle shop called Carp Scene. A blue plaque on the wall is the only monument it ever got. This is the story of the Bradley brothers, a mechanical marvel that defined an era, and the paperwork blunder that separated a name from the hands that built it. Not through one catastrophe. Through a stolen invention, a separated trademark, and a world that moved on to instruments that worked perfectly every time. Chapter 1. The Salesman and the Sideboard. The story begins not with music, but with precision engineering, and not in a recording studio, but in a small Birmingham workshop that smelled of solder and machine oil. Leslie C. Bradley Sr. founded his engineering firm in 1932, only a few hundred yards from Aston Villa's football ground. During the war, the firm manufactured machine tools for the production of Spitfires and Lancasters, the kind of exacting, high-tolerance work that leaves no room for approximation. Leslie had 3 sons, Les, Frank, and Norman. Each joined the business as they left school, and after the war the brothers continued together as Bradmatic Limited, specialising in tape recorder components, amplifiers, and replay heads. They were among the few specialist tape head manufacturers in the whole of the United Kingdom, and their work had a quiet reputation for excellence. The decks they built used 3/4-inch thick Tufnol phenolic resin board, a mark of serious craftsmanship in a trade where shortcuts were common and visible. This was a family business in the fullest sense. Les Bradley was the engineering intellect, the one who drove production and solved problems that stumped everyone else. Frank and Norman worked alongside him. The atmosphere, by all accounts, was warm. Mike Pinder, who would later co-found the Moody Blues, worked at the factory for 18 months in the early 1960s and recalled it simply. The Bradleys were wonderful people to work for. A warm, friendly atmosphere prevailed throughout the small factory. It was a place where you knew every name, where the tea round meant something, where the gap between the man who owned the firm and the lad who swept the floor was measured in yards, not miles. Into this world, in 1962, walked Bill Franson. Franson's background reads like a picaresque novel with chapters missing. He'd been a uranium prospector. He'd been a window cleaner in Upland, California, where one of his clients was an inventor named Harry Chamberlain, who built strange musical machines in his garage. He'd talked his way into a sales job with Chamberlain, spent 9 months selling instruments he believed would never be properly finished, and then, in a move that would alter the course of popular music, he vanished. A radio could be heard playing in his empty apartment. Attempts to contact him proved futile. Franson had left for England by boat, and he'd taken 2 of Harry Chamberlain's instruments with him. He'd removed every Chamberlain label and mark of origin. He was heading for Birmingham, looking for someone who could manufacture 70 matched tape heads for instruments he intended to present as his own. He found Bradmatic Limited. Frank Bradley reportedly guessed the heads must be for some sort of music machine. When Franson showed the brothers what he'd brought, described by them, with characteristic Midlands understatement, as a sideboard with keys on, they were staggered. Here was a cabinet that, when you pressed a key, played back a recording of a real instrument. Not a synthesized approximation, not an electronic tone shaped to resemble a flute. An actual flute, captured on magnetic tape, played back through a speaker. 35 keys, each with its own strip of tape. Each strip recorded with 3 different sounds. The concept was extraordinary. The execution was rough, and the man presenting it was lying about where it came from. Whether Franson's deception was calculated fraud or opportunistic omission depends on which account you trust. What every source agrees on is the result. The Bradleys believed the invention was his. They shook hands with a man who'd stolen someone else's life's work, and they set about turning a Californian curiosity into a British-manufactured instrument. A photograph survives of Franson and Norman Bradley together in the early 60s, two men smiling at the start of something neither could have foreseen. Franson's voice can still be heard too. His exuberant "yeah" at the end of a Dixieland rhythm track was captured during recording sessions and shipped inside every Mellotron the factory ever built. A con man's fingerprint, embedded in the product forever. But the Bradleys needed money. Engineering. Brilliance doesn't pay for tooling. They advertised for financial backing, reportedly in a local newspaper, and the reply came not from Birmingham, but from London, from Eric Robinson, a successful BBC dance band leader and radio broadcaster whose career was, by his own estimation, on the wane. Robinson co-owned IBC Studios at 35 Portland Place with George Clouston. He saw in this strange tape replay keyboard a chance to reinvent himself. His son-in-law, David Nixon, a celebrity television magician, also invested, calling the instrument a musical computer. Together, they formed a company. And in that formation lay the seed of everything that would follow. Chapter 2. The name on someone else's machine. The company they created was called Mellotronix Limited, and it was based in London. The name Mellotron was reportedly Franson's suggestion, derived from either melody and electronics or mellifluous electronics, depending on which source you ask. It was a good name, memorable, musical in itself, and it belonged, from the first day, to the wrong people. Here is the arrangement that would eventually destroy everything the Bradleys built. Mellotronix Limited, the London company, held the Mellotron trademark. It handled sales, distribution, marketing, and the recording of the original sound tapes. Streetly Electronics, as Bradmatic Limited would eventually become, handled all manufacturing. Every single Mellotron ever made was built at 338 Aldridge Road, Streetly, Sutton Coldfield by the Bradley family and their small team of skilled workers. But the name on every instrument belonged to a separate company, in a separate city, controlled by separate people. The separation of brand from maker. It sounds like a business school case study. In practice, it meant that the people who could build the instrument couldn't sell it under their own name, and the people who owned the name couldn't build a single unit without the factory in Birmingham. For as long as everyone prospered, this didn't matter. When it did matter, it mattered absolutely. Eric Robinson arranged the crucial first recording sessions at IBC Studios. Professional musicians were hired. The flutes, the strings, the choirs, the brass, all the sounds that would define an era of rock music, were laid down on tape in a London studio by session players who had no idea what they were contributing to. Jeff Unwin, a variety pianist, was hired in 1962 as the official Mellotronix demonstrator, tasked with showing potential buyers what this cabinet of tapes could do. The first Mellotron Mark I rolled off the production line in December 1963. Red mahogany veneer, highly polished, mother-of-pearl selector buttons. It was beautiful, enormous, and cost £1,000, roughly half the price of a typical British house. Approximately 55 were built. And then Harry Chamberlain found out what had happened to his invention. The moment arrived around 1965, at an American musical instrument trade show, where Chamberlain encountered a copy of his own creation bearing a name he'd never heard. The reaction was, by all accounts, volcanic. He threatened legal action. One source, claiming personal acquaintance with Chamberlain, recalled the resolution. They flew Mr. Chamberlain to England, picked him up at the airport in a Bentley, showed him the studios they built. He was so impressed by their investment that he settled with our man out of court. A settlement was reached in 1966. The financial terms are disputed, either $30,000 or £60,000, depending on the source. £60,000 in 1966 money was a staggering sum, close to $1 million in today's terms. The agreement divided the world. Mellotrons would be sold in the United Kingdom and Chamberlains in the United States. Chamberlain would receive royalty payments, though these apparently ceased by the late 1960s. The two companies traded some master tapes. The legal threat receded, but the episode cast a long shadow. The instrument the Bradleys were building with such care and skill was born from a theft they hadn't known about. The man who'd brought it to their door, Franson, the charming salesman, the former window cleaner and uranium prospector, had deceived them from the start. And the corporate structure that had been erected around their work placed the most valuable asset, the name itself, in hands that had never touched a soldering iron or threaded a strip of tape. The Bradleys kept building. They were engineers. That's what engineers do. Chapter 3. 35 strips of tape. Understanding what happened to the Mellotron, why musicians fell in love with it, why it drove its repairmen to despair, and why its death mattered, requires understanding how the thing actually worked. And understanding how it worked requires accepting that it was, simultaneously, an engineering marvel and a mechanical nightmare. Take the M400, the model that conquered rock music. 35 keys G to F. Each key connected to its own individual length of 3 1/8-inch wide magnetic tape, approximately 6 feet long, recorded with 3 parallel tracks carrying 3 different sounds. At rest, each tape sat in a serpentine W shape, threaded through a system of sprung rollers at the front of the mechanism. Press a key. A rubber pinch roller mounted beneath it grips the tape against a constantly rotating brass capstan shaft that spans the full width of the keyboard. The tape moves across a playback head at 7.5 inches per second. A felt pressure pad pushes the tape firmly against the head. Sound comes out. A flute, a choir, a string section, not a simulation. A recording of the real thing. You have approximately 8 seconds before the tape runs out. Then it stalls, somewhat gracelessly, as one engineer put it. Release the key and a coil spring pulls the tape back to its starting position, producing a faint mechanical whir as the W shape reforms. The A/B/C selector knob physically shifts the playback heads across the tape width to access different tracks. Position it between settings and you'd blend 2 sounds together, with audible artifacts that some musicians found beautiful and others found infuriating. Now multiply all of that by 35. 35 tape heads, 35 pinch rollers, 35 pressure pads, 35 return springs, each requiring individual adjustment. Temperature changes caused tape stretching. Humidity made tapes stick. When multiple keys were pressed simultaneously, the motor dragged and notes went flat. Cleaning the capstan shaft and heads was a ritual. Periodic demagnetization was essential. Robert Fripp captured the instrument's temperament in 5 words. Tuning a Mellotron doesn't. George Martin described it as though a Neanderthal piano had impregnated a primitive electronic keyboard. Les Bradley recalled instruments arriving for repair, looking like a blacksmith had shaped horseshoes on top. And yet, the very qualities that made the Mellotron unreliable made it irreplaceable. Each note sounded subtly different every time it was played. The wow and flutter, the slight detune between adjacent notes, the ghostly quality of the choir sounds, described as dead men singing, gave the instrument an unearthly, emotionally resonant quality that nothing built with perfect digital precision has ever replicated. The imperfection was the art. The sounds themselves were recorded at IBC Studios in London by engineers Alan Stagg and Glyn Johns. Johns was in his early 20s then. He'd go on to produce the Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, and the Eagles. The task was formidable. 35 recordings of musicians playing in time and in tune, 3 recordings across each strip of tape starting simultaneously, multiplied by 6 sound stations. With 1963 technology. No digital editing, no synchronized tape lock. The first full set of rhythm and fill recordings took 3 months to complete. Cellist Reginald Kilby refused to downtune his instrument to cover the lowest notes, so the bottom of the range was performed on double bass instead. The Ted Taylor Choir was recorded in 2 halves, 4 men in one studio, 4 women in an adjacent room, allowing 3 tracks to be captured concurrently. When the male singers reached notes that exceeded their range, they simply dropped back 1 octave. Nobody corrected it. The imperfection shipped. and one note of the string recordings contains a sound that has haunted every Mellotron ever made. During the take, a violinist's chair scraped against the studio floor. The sound was captured. Nobody noticed, or nobody cared enough to re-record. That accidental scrape was duplicated onto every set of string tapes manufactured for decades. Thousands of musicians on thousands of stages played that one note, and the ghost of a shifting chair played with them. The famous flute sound, the one that would open Strawberry Fields Forever and define an entire era, was actually a composite of alto flute and soprano flute recordings. This is why the tuning shifts oddly when chords are played, two different instruments spliced together, pretending to be one. It was a compromise born of the studio limitations of 1963, and it became one of the most recognisable timbres in the history of recorded music. Chapter 4. The Sound That Stopped the World. John Lennon bought a Mellotron Mark II in August 1965 and installed it at Kenwood, his home in Weybridge, Surrey. He used it to compose. He played it at odd hours, cycling through the sound stations, working out ideas. And at some point in late 1966, he found something that would change everything. A two-handed progression on the swinging flutes setting that sounded like nothing anyone had heard before. Recording of Strawberry Fields Forever began on November the 24th, 1966, at Studio 2, EMY Studios, Abbey Road. It was the band's first session after completing Revolver and their final American tour. The old life was over. The studio had become their instrument. And in that studio, Paul McCartney sat down at the Mellotron and played the introduction that opened a door in popular music that has never been closed. Two hands. The flute setting. Bank 4 on the right-hand keyboard. The progression was simple enough to describe on paper and impossible to replicate on any other instrument without losing what made it extraordinary. The wobble, the warmth, the sense of real breath moving through real tubes, captured imperfectly on magnetic tape and played back through a mechanism that couldn't quite keep its own time. John Lennon and George Martin also played Mellotron parts on subsequent takes, layering the instrument deeper into the recording. The haunting reversed Mellotron in the song's coda was achieved by recording the flutes and then playing the tape backwards, an effect that sounded less like an instrument and more like a memory dissolving. Engineer Jeff Emmerich recalled a particular anxiety during the sessions. The Musicians' Union. The Mellotron played back recordings of real instruments performed by session players. Using it instead of hiring live musicians for a recording session was, at best, a grey area. The Beatles were cautious. The Union never intervened. The recording famously required George Martin to splice together two completely different versions of the song. Take 7, gentler and more reflective, and Take 26, heavier, with orchestral scoring at a different tempo and in a different key. Martin achieved the impossible join through meticulous speed manipulation, slowing one version, speeding the other, until they met in the middle. The edit point, once you know where it falls, is audible. Before you're told, it isn't. Released as a double A-side single with Penny Lane on February the 17th, 1967, Strawberry Fields Forever peaked at number 2. It was kept from the top by Engelbert Humperdinck's Please Release Me, a piece of trivia that still provokes disbelief in anyone who hears it for the first time. But the chart position was irrelevant. What mattered was the sound. Every keyboard player in the country heard that introduction and wanted to know what made it. The answer was a mechanical cabinet built in a small factory on Aldridge Road in Streatley, by a family of Birmingham engineers who'd started out making tape heads for other people's equipment. Mike Pinder had introduced the Beatles to the Mellotron during his time straddling both worlds, factory floor and stage. I got to know John, Paul, George and Ringo over the years, and I introduced them to the Tron, he later recalled. Within a week, all 4 of them had a Fabtron. The instrument appeared on track after track across the band's later catalogue. The flamenco guitar that opens the continuing story of Bungalow Bill isn't a guitar at all. It's a pre-recorded Mellotron sample, played by assistant producer Chris Thomas, alongside Mellotron mandolin and trombone. Flying featured extended Mellotron tape loops manipulated into abstract sound collages. A special Mark II in black and gold livery was built for Lennon. Others in the same distinctive finish went to Graham Nash, Richard Wright of Pink Floyd, and John Lord of Deep Purple. Princess Margaret owned a Mellotron. So did Peter Sellers, King Hussein of Jordan, and L. Ron Hubbard. The instrument had crossed from the workshop floor into the living rooms of the famous and the powerful, and the men who built every one of them were still working from the same modest premises on Aldridge Road. Chapter 5. The Cathedrals of Tape. If the Beatles opened the door, it was progressive rock that walked through it, set up camp, and refused to leave. Between 1967 and 1975, the Mellotron became the defining instrument of a genre that prized ambition over economy, and the factory in Streatley became the unlikely engine room of one of the most creatively adventurous periods in British music. The Moody Blues went first. Mike Pinder, the man who'd tested Mellotrons on the factory floor before co-founding the band, obtained a second-hand Mark II from the Fort Dunlop Working Men's Club in Birmingham, a refurbished unit that Les Bradley tracked down for him at a bargain price. Pinder modified it himself, replacing the valve preamplifier with a transistor system, installing printed circuit DC motors for better tuning stability. These modifications were good enough that Streatley later incorporated them into production models. The student had improved the teacher's work. Days of Future Past, released in 1967, established the Mellotron as the Moody Blues signature. Pinder, with recording engineer Derek Varnells and producer Tony Clark, devised a way of playing and recording the instrument that made its sound flow in symphonic waves, rather than cutting off at the 8-second tape limit. The technique was part performance, part studio craft, overlapping notes, careful use of sustain, and an intimate understanding of the instrument's limitations. Nights in White Satin spotlighted the Mellotron in what one critic called yet another new way. The instrument remained central across 7 consecutive albums between 1967 and 1972. Pinder had taken a temperamental curiosity and turned it into the voice of a band. But it was King Crimson who made the Mellotron sound like the end of the world. In the Court of the Crimson King, released in October 1969, was the landmark. Ian MacDonald was the primary player, using a Mellotron Mark II. On Epitaph, he revealed a technique that transformed the instrument. There were 2 tracks of Mellotron, and I kept the volume of the 2 tracks moving all the time, very subtly, up and down against each other. You do get a sense of motion on the sustained chords. That subtle motion, 2 slightly different tape playbacks surging against one another, gave the Mellotron its famously emotional, oceanic quality. It wasn't an orchestra. It was something more unsettling than an orchestra. Recordings of real instruments, degraded through generations of tape copying, played back through a mechanism that wobbled and warped, layered and cross-faded by a musician who understood that imperfection was the whole point. Music historian Jeff Gold wrote that King Crimson abandoned most of rock's R&B roots to embrace a kind of guitar and Mellotron-based crypto-classical style that went well beyond what Procol Harum and the Moody Blues had previously attempted. The album sold well. MacDonald and drummer Michael Giles left after just 1 record. MacDonald would later co-found Foreigner. And Robert Fripp took over the Mellotron, carrying it forward into a future he couldn't have predicted. Tony Banks of Genesis heard Epitaph and was transformed. When I heard the first King Crimson album with the Mellotron crescendo on Epitaph, I felt that it would be a very useful instrument to have. He bought a Mark II from Robert Fripp in 1971, reportedly the very machine that had been used on In the Court of the Crimson King. The lineage was direct. Factory to Fripp to Banks. Birmingham engineering passed hand to hand across the stages of progressive rock. Banks pioneered something new. Where others had used the Mellotron to imitate orchestras, Banks played dense block chords, stacking notes in combinations that no real string section would attempt. The 2-minute Mellotron solo that opens Watcher of the Skies from 1972's Foxtrot is one of the most famous Mellotron passages in rock history. Banks used 3 violins on the right hand, blended with brass by positioning the selector switch between its proper settings, that in-between zone where 2 tracks bled into each other with audible artifacts, and bass accordion on the left. The result was enormous, eerie, and entirely dependent on the Mellotron's inability to stay perfectly in tune. Banks acknowledged this openly. There are some chords you can't play on that instrument, because they'd be so out of tune. These chords created an incredible atmosphere. He also acknowledged the cost. I'm no lover of Mellotrons, really. They became a real problem. We had to literally rebuild it after each concert. The machine that made Genesis sound like nothing else on Earth also required constant, exhausting maintenance from a band that was travelling the country in the back of a van. Rick Wakeman of Yes went further still. Bought an M400 upon joining the band in 1971, he went completely Mellotron mad on Close to the Edge in 1972, stuffing every available space with strings, brass and flutes. In 1973, a custom double Mellotron was built for him from two M400s, serial numbers 259 and 332, designed by Michael Tate in collaboration with Streetly Electronics. This doubled instrument served as a prototype for the later Mark V. Wakeman had a secret. He'd discovered that you could keep the Mellotron roughly in tune if you never played more than 2 notes simultaneously, using the pitch control to compensate for drift. He kept this technique to himself, a competitive advantage in session work where other keyboard players struggled with the instrument's temperament. It served him spectacularly on one of the most celebrated recordings of the era. In 1969, producer Tony Visconti called Wakeman at a rehearsal. I'm at Trident Studios with Gus Dudgeon and David Bowie. David desperately wants the Mellotron to go with the other strings, and nobody can keep the effing thing in tune. Wakeman came. He played. 1 take. David Bowie said, "That's it." The song was Space Oddity. Wakeman later recalled, "It was one of half a dozen occasions where it made the hair stand up on your neck, and you know you're involved in something special. The instrument was everywhere." Led Zeppelin's John Paul Jones created the mournful string textures on the Rain song in 1973, though he acknowledged the advantage the Moody Blues had over everyone else. They had the guy who invented it working for them, and I didn't. Tangerine Dream used it extensively on Atom and Phaedra. During the recording of the latter at the Manor studio, the resident Irish wolfhound reportedly urinated against the band's Mellotron, which may be the most perfectly symbolic indignity ever suffered by a musical instrument. The move took Blackberry Way to number 1 in 1968, with Mellotron prominently featured. Jethro Tull, Elton John, Aerosmith, Barclay James Harvest, Gentle Giant, Van der Graaf Generator, Hawkwind, The Strawbs. The list of users reads like a roll call of the era's most ambitious musicians. And every one of those instruments came from one place, one factory, one family. A modest building on Aldridge Road in Streetly, a suburb that, as one writer put it, can't decide whether it's dead posh or dead rough. Chapter 6. The Summit. By the early 1970s, the M400 had changed the economics of the Mellotron and the geography of rock music. Where the Mark II had weighed 350 pounds, required 2 men and a prayer to move, and cost the equivalent of half a house, the M400 came in at 122 pounds in a white lacquered cabinet. Still heavy, still temperamental, but manageable for touring, especially with its key innovation, the removable tape frame. A self-contained unit with pre-threaded tapes, springs and rollers that could be swapped in 3 to 5 minutes, allowing musicians to change their entire sound palette between songs. No internal amplification, just a solid-state preamp and a 1/4-inch output. Plug it in and go. Or try to. Between 1970 and 1986, approximately 1,800 to 2,000 M and 400s were built, the vast majority of all Mellotrons ever manufactured. At £625 to £795 in the United Kingdom, or $3,500 through Streetly's American distributor, it was expensive but not prohibitive for a working band. And every serious progressive rock band in the country either owned one or wanted one. The confidence showed. EMI negotiated a licensing deal to assemble 100 M400s from kits supplied by Streetly, a potentially significant scaling opportunity that would take the instrument beyond what one small factory could produce. The Mark V went into development in 1975, 2 M400s in a single cabinet. The ultimate Mellotron for the player who wanted everything at once. Only 28 to 31 were ever built, at £2,200 each. John Lennon owned one. Paul McCartney owned one. Mike Pinder owned one. A special left-handed model was custom built for McCartney. A plexiglass demonstration unit appeared at the 1972 London Music Expo. International distribution was established and growing. Dallas Arbiter, later Dallas Music Industries, handled the American market from New Jersey. Instruments reached Europe, South Africa. 15 400FX consoles were sold to the South African Broadcasting Corporation and the Middle East. Phil Dawson, who ran a recording studio just a couple of miles from the factory near Aldridge, was asked by Les and Norman Bradley to record string tapes at his studio. The relationship between factory and client was direct and personal. Tony Banks sent his machine back to Streatley for repairs. Rick Wakeman's double Mellotron had been built in direct collaboration with the factory team. Musicians, servicing and engineering all intertwined in a tight community centred on one building. A 1981 photograph shows the factory, a modest, unremarkable commercial property on a suburban road. Les Bradley's Jaguar is parked out front. Not a Rolls-Royce, not a fleet of company cars, one man's Jaguar, a modest marker of modest success. Inside, the work continued as it always had. Hand-built, craft scale, each of 35 tape mechanisms adjusted individually, each instrument tested before it left. This was not mass production. This was one family's engineering legacy, produced in the same way their father had taught them, in a building their father had worked in before them. At the peak, the Mellotron was on records that defined the sound of an era. It was in the homes of princesses and musicians and cult leaders. It was on stages across the world, being wrestled into tune by keyboard players who cursed it and loved it in equal measure. The factory was full. The orders were coming. The future looked, if not certain, then at least solid. But three things were already true that nobody at 338 Aldridge Road had the power to change. The name on every instrument they built belonged to someone else. The American distribution chain was about to collapse. And in laboratories and workshops in Connecticut, Tokyo and the Netherlands, engineers were building instruments that would do everything the Mellotron did. Without the tapes, without the springs, without the 8-second limit, without the maintenance, and at a fraction of the cost. The summit is always the place where you can see the furthest. It's also the place where the ground starts falling away. Chapter 7. 3 Waves and a Punk. The forces that would destroy the Mellotron didn't arrive as a single catastrophe. They came in waves, each one eroding a different part of the instrument's reason for existing, until there was almost nothing left to stand on. The first wave was the cheapest and the most immediately damaging. In 1974, the ARP/Selena String Ensemble appeared, a fully polyphonic string synthesizer manufactured in the Netherlands that offered lush, sweeping string sounds at a fraction of the Mellotron's cost, a fraction of its weight, and with none of its maintenance requirements. You plugged it in, you played it. It stayed in tune. It didn't care about humidity. Its tapes didn't stick because it had no tapes. Italian manufacturers flooded in behind. The Logan String Melody, the Elka Rhapsody, the Farfisa Synth Orchestra, a succession of Krumar models. These instruments cost a fraction of what a Mellotron cost and weighed a fraction of what a Mellotron weighed. They were, as one contemporary assessment put it with brutal economy, far more reliable and more portable. They didn't sound like a Mellotron. They didn't have the ghostly depth, the organic wobble, the sense of real musicians breathing behind the notes. But for a keyboard player who needed orchestral textures on stage without hiring an orchestra or rebuilding a tape mechanism after every concert, they were good enough. Good enough has killed more great instruments than any amount of inferiority. The second wave arrived in the late 1970s. The Sequential Circuits Prophet 5, released in 1978, was the first practical, fully programmable, polyphonic synthesizer, 5 voices, patch memory, stable tuning. Combined with the Oberheim range and the Polymug, These instruments offered keyboard players flexible, reliable polyphonic sound creation, without a single moving tape, spring, or capstan. You could design sounds, store them, recall them, tour with them. The Mellotron could do none of these things. It played back recordings made in a London studio in 1963. That was all it could ever do. The third wave was digital, and it was final. The Fairlight. CMI arrived in 1979, a digital sampling workstation that could record any sound and play it back from a keyboard. The EMU emulator followed in 1981, the Ensoniq Mirage in 1984, and in 1983 the Yamaha DX7 landed. Affordable, light, versatile, and capable of sounds no analog instrument could produce. Digital technology could do everything the Mellotron did. Playback recordings of real instruments. A sampler could do that with perfect reliability, lighter weight, lower cost, and infinitely more flexibility. The Mellotron's entire reason for existing, giving a keyboard player access to the sounds of a real orchestra, had been superseded by machines that did the same job better in every measurable way. And then, as if the technological ground hadn't shifted enough, the cultural ground shifted too. Punk rock arrived in 1976 and declared war on everything progressive rock represented. The elaborate arrangements, the extended compositions, the banks of keyboards, the concept albums about mythical kingdoms, all of it was dismissed as self-indulgent excess. The Mellotron, with its orchestral pretensions and its 300-pound cabinet, became the emblem of a pompous era that the new music wanted to bury. Sound on sound captured the convergence with surgical precision. The advent of cheap string machines and primitive polyphonic synthesizers made it much simpler for keyboard players to obtain orchestral textures, and the birth of punk rock meant that they no longer needed to. Overnight, the Mellotron became a dinosaur. Overnight is an exaggeration. The process took the better part of a decade. But from the vantage point of 338 Aldridge Road, where each instrument still took weeks to assemble by hand, where 35 tape mechanisms still required individual adjustment, where the cost structure assumed a market that valued craftsmanship over convenience. From that vantage point, the ground was falling away, and there was nothing to hold on to. The M300, an earlier attempt at a portable single-manual Mellotron built between 1968 and 1970, had already damaged the brand. A cost-cutting decision had replaced the DC motor with a fixed-speed AC motor, and new tape guides built up static charge, causing tapes to wrap around the selection drums. Only 52 to 60 were built, but the M300 was largely responsible for the Mellotron's wider reputation as an instrument that couldn't be trusted. The quality had faltered once. Now the market was faltering beneath it. Chapter 8. The Paperwork Blunder. To understand the catastrophe of 1977, you have to understand the chain of hands between Birmingham and America. From approximately 1972, United States distribution was handled by Dallas Arbiter, later renamed Dallas Music Industries, based in New Jersey. Bill Eberline served as their sales manager, the man responsible for getting Mellotrons into American music shops and onto American stages. In 1976, Mellotronics Limited in London transferred US distribution rights to a new company called Sound Sales Inc. The new company had been founded by Bill Eberline himself, the same man who'd been selling Mellotrons for Dallas. The poacher had become the gamekeeper, or perhaps the other way round. A shadowy partner whose identity remains undocumented was also involved. The arrangement was, at best, poorly supervised. At worst, it was a trap waiting to spring. In 1977, Dallas Music Industries collapsed. The debt owed to Mellotronics Limited was approximately £80,000. Mike Pinder's account suggests that Dallas Arbiter's financial difficulties may have begun as early as 1975, with the final collapse coming 2 years later. A slow-motion catastrophe that nobody in London appears to have moved quickly enough to contain. £80,000. For a company the size of Mellotronics Limited, a sales and marketing operation, not to manufacturer, this was not a setback. It was a fatal wound. The London company could not meet its financial obligations. It was forced into liquidation. What happened next has been described by every person who was there or who investigated it afterwards in terms that range from bewilderment to fury. Peter Forrest, author of The AZ of Analog Synthesizers, wrote, "In a devastating liquidation blunder, the inventory and the rights to the name were sold to an American firm who had been servicing Mellotrons but not manufacturing them. Norm Leet, the engineer who would later collaborate on the M4000 revival, put it plainly. The registered name Mellotron was accidentally lost along with the other assets of the company, Mellotronics." Mike Pinder was more specific about who benefited. Thanks to a paperwork blunder, the Mellotron name was sold to one of the Dallas Arbiter personnel, leaving the Bradleys to choose the new name, Novatron. The National Music Center recorded that the trademark dispute arose on account of several overlooked terms of an American distribution agreement. Here is what happened, stripped to its bones. The liquidator appointed to wind up Mellotronics Limited sold the company's assets, as liquidators do. Among those assets were the physical inventory, the Mellotron master tapes, one of the two EMI tape-cutting machines nicknamed Mothertron, and the registered trademark Mellotron. All of it was sold to Bill Eberlein and his company Sound Sales. The master tapes, the original IBC Studios recordings, from which every Mellotron's sounds derived. Those sessions captured by Alan Stagg and Glyn Johns in the early 1960s crossed the Atlantic into American hands. The clear Perspex demonstration Mellotron went with them. It was later stolen while on display in New York. The liquidator was not acting maliciously. He was doing his job, converting a bankrupt company's assets into cash to pay creditors. The problem was that nobody, not the liquidator, not anyone advising him, appears to have grasped the distinction between the assets of Mellotronics Limited and the interests of Streetly Electronics. The trademark had always belonged to Mellotronics, the London sales company. When Mellotronics was liquidated, the trademark went with it. Streetly Electronics, the Birmingham manufacturer, had no legal claim to a name it had never owned. Sound Sales, a company founded by a former distributor's sales manager, a company that had never manufactured a single Mellotron, now owned the right to call the instrument by its name. The people who had actually built every Mellotron in existence could no longer use the word. And here is the detail that transforms a business failure into a tragedy. Streetly Electronics was financially sound at the time of the trademark loss. Norm Leet stressed the point. Two sad facts here. Firstly, Streetly, who were actually producing the instruments, were still financially sound. And secondly, they were no longer allowed to call the instrument they produced Mellotrons. The National Music Center confirmed. Sound Sales was able to retain the Mellotron name despite having never manufactured a single instrument. No documented legal challenge by the Bradleys has been found in any source. The available evidence suggests they simply couldn't fight it. They were a small Birmingham engineering family, not a multinational with a legal department. The trademark had always belonged to someone else, that structural flaw baked into the company's formation in 1962, when Eric Robinson's London operation took the name and the Bradleys took the workbench. For 15 years it hadn't mattered. Now it was the only thing that mattered, and there was nothing they could do. The Bradleys accepted the loss. They renamed the instrument the Novatron. Manuals from the period instructed owners, with painful formality, "We are no longer able to use the name Mellotron," and asked them to substitute the new name Novatron in its place when reading this manual. Chapter 9. The Name They Couldn't Say. The Novatron years, from 1977 to 1986, were a long diminishing. The instruments were essentially rebranded Mellotrons. The Novatron 400 SM was an M400 with a different badge. The Novatron Mark V was the same twin cabinet design. But the name change was devastating. The Mellotron's identity, its mystique, its association with the Beatles and King Crimson and Genesis, belonged to someone else now. Novatron sounded like a kitchen appliance. The company tried. In 1981, they produced the Novatron T550. the only genuinely new design of this era. It was essentially an M400 in a flight case built for touring. Only 5 were ever made. The price was $4,495. It was a good instrument built for a market that no longer existed. Meanwhile, sound sales in America produced their own instrument under the Mellotron name, the Mellotron 4-track. Approximately 5 were ever made. The recording quality was poor. The enterprise was a shadow of a shadow. Sound sales itself went bankrupt by the mid-1980s. The name they'd acquired through a liquidator's oversight proved worthless in the hands of people who couldn't build the thing it referred to. But by then, the damage had been compounded by everything else. The synthesizers were cheaper, the digital samplers were lighter, the cultural moment had passed. Progressive rock had retreated to the margins, and the keyboard players who'd built their sound around the Mellotron had moved on to instruments that didn't need rebuilding after every performance. Tony Banks abandoned the Mellotron entirely by 1980. Rick Wakeman burned 2 of his M400s in a bonfire in 1982. An act of destruction that reads, depending on your sympathies, as either liberating or heartbreaking. The EMI licensing deal, which should have been a chance to scale production, had already turned to ash. The 100 M400 kits sent to EMI for assembly had been so poorly put together by EMI's workers that most had to be returned to Streetly for proper work. The one opportunity to break out of craft-scale production and into something larger had failed, not because of Streetly's engineering, but because nobody else could match it. Streetly's last attempt at survival was the Studio Symphony, a 16-bit digital sampler prototype begun in 1985. Only a single unit was ever built. It never reached production. The irony was absolute. The company that had built the world's first practical sampling instrument was trying to survive by building a digital sampler. The very technology that had made their original instrument obsolete. Too little. Too late. Too far from the craft they understood. In 1986, Frank Bradley was already 7 years dead, taken by a heart attack in 1979 during the early Novatron period, just 2 years after the trademark loss. The stress of watching everything you'd built being stripped of its identity, it's impossible to say what role that played, but the timing speaks for itself. Appeals to music business celebrities to rescue the firm went unheeded. The famous names who'd built their careers on the Mellotron's sound had moved on to other instruments, other sounds, other concerns. The factory that had served them was someone else's problem now. Streetly Electronics went into voluntary liquidation in 1986. Before closing, Les Bradley threw most of the manufacturing equipment into a skip. The image sits there. The father of the Mellotron, the man who'd driven the engineering, who'd solved the problems, who'd built instruments for Lennon and Banks and Wakeman, standing in the yard of his own factory, throwing the tools his family had used for more than 2 decades into a skip. Not because the work was bad, not because the instruments were unwanted, because a liquidator had sold a name, and the world had moved on, and there was nothing left to do but clear up. Les Bradley's Jaguar had once been parked out front. The building had once hummed with the sound of tape mechanisms being tested, of capstans being aligned, of music being threaded into machines by hand. Now the machinery was in a skip, and the silence was the wrong shape. A silence that shouldn't have been there, in a building designed for the precise, patient work of making sound. From 1963 to 1986, approximately 2,500 units had been built. Surviving instruments were, as one account recorded, being scrapped off or left abandoned in squalid conditions in damp cellars and dusty storerooms. The instruments that had given the Beatles their most haunting introduction, that had made King Crimson sound like the end of civilization, that had let Tony Banks build chords so out of tune they created an atmosphere no orchestra could replicate. They were rotting in cellars. Nobody wanted them. Nobody could fix them. The men who could were clearing out a factory in Streetly and wondering what came next. Harry Chamberlain, the Californian inventor whose stolen creation had started everything, died in 1986, the same year Streetly closed. David Nixon, the TV magician who'd invested and called the Mellotron a musical computer, had died in 1978. Eric Robinson, the band leader who'd brought London money to Birmingham engineering, had died in the 1970s. Bill Franson, the charming thief who'd carried 2 stolen instruments across the Atlantic and changed the sound of popular music, had died sometime in the 1980s. No specific date, no obituary, no record of where or how. The principals were dead or dying. The factory was closed. The name belonged to someone in America. The instruments were in cellars. Chapter 10. The Pint That Changed Everything. The revival begins, as the best stories do, with an obsession that refused to die. Martin Smith was a moody blues fan. Not a casual admirer, the kind of fan who tracked down the factory where the instruments were built. He'd found Streetly Electronics as early as 1970, a teenager drawn to the source of a sound that had shaped his imagination. In 1988, wanting a Mellotron of his own, he got back in touch with Les Bradley. Les pointed him towards the moody blues themselves, and Smith eventually bought Ray Thomas's Mark II from Les at a fair price. In 1989, John Bradley, Les's son, who'd grown up in the factory, who'd built Mellotrons alongside his father from childhood, who described himself as also a metal fabricator, came with Les to service the machine. That evening, over a pint at a pub near the old factory, 3 men sat and talked about what might still be possible. Les Bradley, his son John, and Martin Smith, the engineer, the inheritor, and the fan. They decided to produce a Mellotron tribute album. Their very first job was servicing Robert Fripp's machines, the same instruments that had been used on In the Court of the Crimson King. The hands of a Bradley were on the capstans again. Smith produced Rhyme of the Ancient Sampler in 1993, a tribute album featuring Mike Pinder, Wooly Wollstonehome of Barclay James Harvest, David Cross of King Crimson, and Nick Magnus from the Steve Hackett Band. The musicians who'd built their sound on the Mellotron came back to it, one by one, recording new music on the instruments they'd never quite stopped loving. In 1994, Bradley and Smith established Mellotron Archives UK on a part-time basis, servicing and restoring vintage machines while holding down their day jobs. Les Bradley died on January 15, 1997. He was the last of the original engineering generation, the man who'd invented the double-decker tape transport, who'd driven production for over 2 decades, who'd thrown the tools into the skip when it was all over. He survived long enough to see the first stirrings of the revival, but not its full flowering. He'd been there at the pub, over that pint, when the idea took shape. He'd serviced Fripp's machines with his own hands. He died knowing that his son and Martin Smith were carrying something forward, even if its shape wasn't yet clear. After Les's death, John Bradley and Martin Smith made a decision. They ditched their day jobs, readopted the Streetly Electronics name, and went full-time. For the next decade, they survived by doing what the family had always done, working with their hands, refurbishing vintage machines, making tapes and tape frames. The work was painstaking. George Harrison's Mellotron had been left in a shed for 30 years and needed complete restoration. Paul McCartney's Abbey Road machine required similar care. Each instrument that came back to life was a small act of resurrection performed in a workshop that had moved from Aldridge Road to One Rose Cottages, Rugeley, Staffordshire, rural, modest, hidden away. As one profile described them, hidden away in deepest Staffordshire, 2 gentlemen boomers keep a key sound of prog-rock alive. Norm Leet, the engineer who'd later co-designed the M4000, was also part of the revival. A third hand in the work of rebuilding what had been lost. Or rather, what had been thrown into a skip and scattered across damp cellars and dusty storerooms and American bankruptcy courts. In 2007, they launched the M4000. The first genuinely new cycling tape replay keyboard in nearly 40 years. 24 sound sets instead of 3. A digital bank selector emulating the Mark II's original mechanical cycling system. Improved keyboard action. A Filtron air filtration system housed in a pressurized cabinet to protect the tapes from the dust and humidity that had plagued every previous model. Price from £4,900. By November 2021, approximately 55 had been built. Streetly later honoured Tony Banks by creating a Watcher Mix sound for the M4000. a preset that recreated the blended, between-settings combination he'd pioneered on Watcher of the Skies nearly 4 decades earlier. The machine had a memory now. Not digital memory. Historical memory. The sounds of the past, preserved in the mechanisms of the present. The company could not, however, call itself by the name it had made famous. The Mellotron trademark had passed through American hands, from sound sales to David Keane, a Calgary-based musicologist who purchased the bankrupt Mellotron estate in 1989. And then to Marcus Resch, a Swedish engineer who acquired full ownership by 2001. Resch produced the Mark VI Mellotron from the late 1990s, shipping over 100 units. In 2010, he released the M4000D, the first fully digital Mellotron hardware, containing 100 uncompressed 24-bit sounds from the original tapes. No tape mechanism at all. The name Mellotron on a machine with no tapes inside it. The official Streetly Electronics FAQ acknowledges the situation with the kind of understatement that could only come from Birmingham. The company no longer owns the trademark, which was lost in 1986, but they are proud owners of the heritage and lineage as well as the original jigs and fixtures. Heritage, lineage, jigs and fixtures. Not the name. Never the name. Chapter 11. The Fishing Tackle Shop. 338 Aldridge Road, Streetly, Sutton Coldfield, B742DT. The address where the Beatles' most haunting introduction was born, where King Crimson's apocalyptic Mellotron crescendos were engineered into existence, where Tony Banks's impossible chords were made possible by a mechanism that couldn't stay in tune, where a family of Birmingham engineers built approximately 2,500 instruments over 23 years, by hand, one at a time, each with 35 strips of tape threaded through 35 sets of springs and rollers and pressure pads, adjusted individually, tested before they left. The building is a fishing tackle shop now. Carp Scene, Birmingham, specialising in carp angling supplies. A blue plaque on the wall is the only marker of what happened inside. There is no museum, no memorial garden, no exhibition, no heritage trail. A visitor would pass it without a second glance, just another retail unit on a suburban road in a suburb that can't decide what it wants to be. The building appears in that 1981 photograph as a modest, unremarkable commercial property. Les Bradley's Jaguar parked outside. Modest success on a modest street. Inside, the warm hum of tape mechanisms being tested. Outside, suburban Streetly, going about its business. Today, the Jaguar is gone, and the hum is gone, and the Bradleys are gone, and in their place are rods and reels and bait, and the quiet commerce of a hobby that has nothing to do with what these walls once held. The sounds survive, though. Not on tape, or rather, not only on tape. GeForce Software released the M-Tron in 2001, the first Mellotron plugin. The current version contains over 800 presets. The M-Tron Mark II, released in 2022, uses over 4,500 individual samples curated from the Streetly archives. Arturia's Mellotron 5 uses physical modelling. Logic Pro has built-in Mellotron instruments. iPad apps exist. You can buy a software Mellotron for £75 that offers more sounds than any real Mellotron ever did, running on a laptop that weighs a fraction of the M400's 55 kilograms. Streetly collaborates with these digital recreations and profits from them. The tapes that sound most authentic, though, aren't the pristine master recordings. Those crossed the Atlantic in 1977 and passed through American bankruptcy and Swedish ownership. The tapes that sound like a Mellotron are the copies of copies, several generations removed from the originals. As one technical source explains, the tapes in production Mellotrons were actually made from copy masters and work masters, which were several tape generations away from the originals. The ensuing degradation in sound is what creates the distinctive mellotronic sound we know and love. The degradation is the sound. The imperfection is the art. The very quality that made the instrument impossible to manufacture efficiently, that each note wobbled, that each playback was subtly different, that the whole mechanism drifted and warped and resisted perfection, is the quality that makes it irreplaceable. Digital instruments can reproduce the notes. They cannot reproduce the feeling that something alive and slightly wrong is happening beneath the surface. The musicians came back. Oasis used Mellotron cello on Wonderwall in 1995. Radiohead's Johnny Greenwood acquired an M400 that had once belonged to Tangerine Dream and used it extensively on OK Computer. He'd been inspired by Genesis, of all things. I remember hearing a Genesis record and thinking the Mellotron sounded amazing, so I stole it. I love the fact that the notes run out after a few seconds. The Mellotron choir on Exit Music for a Film is one of the defining modern Mellotron moments, that sound of dead men singing, revived for a new generation who'd never heard the original. Noel Gallagher, Trent Reznor, Nils Frahm, Foo Fighters, Smashing Pumpkins, Fleet Foxes, Wilco, Muse, Air, Beck, Coldplay, Kanye West, Vampire Weekend. The list of modern users grows longer every year. Vintage M400s in restored condition now command £3,000 to £8,000. The last refurbished Mark II, sold by Streetly, had a buy-in price of £7,000 and sold for £14,000. With only 2,500 ever built and many destroyed or deteriorated, scarcity drives extraordinary prices for instruments that were once abandoned in damp cellars. Mike Pinder, the man who'd tested Mellotrons on the factory floor, who'd introduced the instrument to the Beatles, who'd made it the voice of the Moody Blues, who'd discovered a second-hand Mark II at the Fort Dunlop Working Men's Club and modified it until the factory adopted his improvements, died on April 24, 2024, the last surviving original member of the Moody Blues. The bridge between the workbench and the stage, gone. John Bradley and Martin Smith continue the work from their Staffordshire workshop. The jigs and fixtures that Les Bradley used are still in service. The knowledge and it was resurrected by the same technology. Software recreations of the degraded copies of recordings made in a London studio in 1963. Sold as digital downloads to musicians who want to hear what imperfection sounds like. The sounds it played were always copies. Recordings of real musicians, duplicated through generations of tape, degraded a little more with each transfer. And it is precisely that degradation, that ghostly, wobbling, not quite right quality, that keeps the Mellotron alive. The machine was born from a theft, built by honest hands, lost through a paperwork blunder, and preserved by the very technology that destroyed it. The flaw became its immortality, not through one catastrophe. Through a stolen invention, a separated trademark, a collapsed distributor, a liquidator's oversight, and a world that moved on to instruments that worked perfectly every time. The Mellotron never worked perfectly. That was the whole point. And in a fishing tackle shop on Aldridge Road, behind a blue plaque that most people walk past without reading, the silence where the sound used to be is the only monument the factory ever got.